A short time ago, the United States military began major combat operations in Iran. Our objective is to defend the American people by eliminating imminent threats from the Iranian regime. To the great, proud people of Iran, when we are finished, take over your government. It will be yours to take. This will be probably your only chance for generations. America is backing you with overwhelming strength and devastating force. End quote. These were the words of American President Donald J. Trump, who in a video to social media in the early hours of Saturday morning announced to the world that the US had launched long-expected strikes against Iran. In the 8-minute video, President Trump made his case for the operation, which the US Department of War labeled Operation Epic Fury, saying that the Iranian regime had long been a threat, not just to the American people and their allies, but to the Iranian people as well, citing the thousands killed in the January protests. Trump further claimed that Iran posed an even greater threat, since they were trying to rebuild their nuclear weapons program and were developing long-range missiles capable of striking Europe and America. Finally, he urged the Iranian people to overthrow the government, a repetition of a call he'd made during the protests. Shortly afterwards, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu posted a video to social media reiterating the same points that Trump had made about the threat posed by Iran, and also calling on the Iranian people to overthrow their government. Statements from the two world leaders came hours after explosions were first heard in Tehran, where, according to the Iranian news agency Fars, missiles had struck close to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, headquarters. The Associated Press further reported that a strike had happened near the offices of Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, indicating that America and Israel were attempting to decapitate Iranian leadership in the initial strike. So, because 2026 has decided that we won't be catching a break anytime soon, let's examine what we know about the strikes, what we don't, and what these attacks mean for the wider region. What we know. Okay, let's start with what we know as of the time of recording. It's just before 2 p.m. Central European time. I just finished my lunch. And multiple outlets reported that the attack began at around 8 a.m. local time in Tehran, which, according to an Israeli security source that spoke with Israel's Channel 12 News, was meant to surprise the Iranians, who wouldn't have anticipated a daytime attack. Nor are they the only ones. Over here at WarFronts, we'd been planning coverage for a potential night attack for weeks, and now here we all are giving up our Saturdays on the first sunny day of the year. It's streaming in my window right now. You're welcome. Like this video? The source also confirmed 3 other important details. 1, that the US and Israel had been planning this operation jointly for months. 2, that Israel was going to go all out during this operation, and that Washington was on the same page. And 3, that the initial phase of the joint attack was meant to last for 4 days. American officials who spoke with the New York Times corroborated the idea that Israel and the US would go all out, telling the paper that the bombing campaign would likely be more extensive than Operation Midnight Hammer, in which US bombers struck key Iranian nuclear sites during the 12-day war. At the moment, it's difficult to get a full picture of all the locations within Iran that were hit because, according to global internet watchdog NetBlocks, the government instituted a near-total internet shutdown. But what we do know indicates that Israel and the US are keeping their word. A source speaking to the Wall Street Journal said that the initial wave of strikes largely targeted military assets to blunt Iran's ability to respond, symbols of the regime, and intelligence targets. The most notable of these included Pasteur Street, a secure area of Tehran that hosts the offices of the Iranian president, the center of Iran's Revolutionary Guard and intelligence leadership, the Supreme National Security Council, and other military institutions. Iranian news agencies also reported explosions in other cities. Isfahan, near the site of a nuclear complex that both the US and Israel struck last year during the 12-day war. Kermanshah, in northwestern Iran, home to an Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps base, and Shiraz, where the Israelis have alleged Iran has a large underground missile production facility. Al Jazeera reported that a renewed wave of explosions were heard in Tehran at around 1 p.m. local time, indicating that this would be a sustained operation. The outlet, however, couldn't verify the locations of the strikes because of the internet blackout. And that blackout has also made it difficult to get a full picture of the casualties, especially given that Israel and the US were explicitly targeting Iranian leadership. Iranian state-affiliated media, including Tasnim and Mer news agencies, are reporting that President Masoud Pezeshkian is safe, while Reuters are reported that Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has been transferred to a secure location prior to the strikes. However, an Iranian source close to the establishment told Reuters that several IRGC commanders and political officials were killed in the strikes. Israel's Channel 12 appeared to corroborate this report. Citing unnamed security sources, the outlet reported that the strikes had achieved very high success in targeting key senior commanders and that Israel was happy with the initial results. As of the time of writing, Israeli sources indicate that the leader of Iran's Revolutionary Guard, its ministers of defense and intelligence, and its lead nuclear negotiator are all among the dead. We should also note that while Iranian state media has acknowledged that the nation's president, its chief justice, and several other key officials are safe, it has not yet said the same for the supreme leader. With the benefit of hindsight, we also know that Israel has been telegraphing this attack for a while now through their strikes on one of Iran's main proxies, Hezbollah. On the 20th of this month, the IDF launched airstrikes into Lebanon, killing several officials who the IDF accused of planning operations against Israel. The IDF also launched airstrikes on Friday, hours before the attack on Iran, that, according to Ron Ben Yeshai, an analyst at the Israeli outlet Ynet, were intended to blind the organization's detection systems, which were meant to alert the Iranians to the Israeli Air Force's departure for the preemptive strike. Afghan news outlet Tolo News later reported that Israel had carried out additional strikes on Lebanon against Hezbollah targets, which were meant to prevent the group from intervening in the war. All of which leads us to Iran's response. Within hours of the initial American and Israeli strikes, the IRGC announced that it had launched the first large-scale wave of retaliatory missile and drone strikes toward Israel. Sirens blared across Israel as the military worked to intercept incoming fire, with preliminary assessments indicating at least 35 ballistic missiles were launched at Israel throughout the day. Some missiles were intercepted, others struck open areas, and one person was lightly injured by falling debris. But Iran did not stop at Israel. The IRGC confirmed strikes on American military installations across the Gulf, including Al Salan Air Base in Kuwait, Al Dhafra Air Base in the UAE, Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, and the US Navy's 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain. Explosions were heard in Abu Dhabi, Kuwait City, Doha, and even Riyadh. Qatar's defense ministry said that it had successfully intercepted Iranian missiles, while the UAE reported one civilian killed in Abu Dhabi after intercepting several missiles. The UAE called the attack a flagrant violation of national sovereignty and said it reserves its right to respond in full. Both Bahrain and Qatar also condemned the strikes, with Bahrain calling them treacherous. Footage emerging from the Gulf nations shows what appear to have been successful hits in Bahrain and Abu Dhabi at a minimum. Critically, those hits did not impact oil or other energy infrastructure, suggesting that Iran has either declined to strike energy targets at this time, or its missiles have been intercepted. According to statements from multiple Gulf states, regional governments may now join the US offensive against Iran. The question now is what other options Iran has to escalate. As we mentioned previously, Israel is actively working to prevent Hezbollah from intervening. We also don't expect Hamas to intervene, given how decisively Israel crippled their infrastructure following the October 7th attacks. The Houthis in Yemen, however, are an entirely different matter. After the strikes, they announced the renewal of missile and drone attacks on sea lanes and on Israel. Two unnamed officials confirmed the resumption of attacks to the AP agency, saying that they expected the first wave to happen as early as Saturday evening, Israel time. The Houthis had previously suspended attacks on sea routes in the Red Sea and Israel as part of an agreement with the Trump administration. Meanwhile, in Iraq, Iran-linked militias are believed to have been responsible for a first round of rocket attacks, with more probably on the way. Obviously, by the time you watch this, we'll have a clearer picture of exactly which proxies retaliated and how, but as of 2 o'clock Central European time, this is as clear a picture as we can muster. Away from the battlefields, the international response has been interesting to watch. The British government announced that it had not participated in the strikes and did not want to see further escalation into a wider regional conflict. It added that it had recently enhanced its defensive capabilities in the Middle East. The German government said that it had been warned in advance of the strikes and was monitoring the situation, while the EU's top executive, Ursula von der Leyen, issued a statement that it was crucial to prevent any actions that could further escalate tensions. So far, this was all as expected. However, the UK's insistence that it wasn't involved suggests London is trying to maintain some distance from Washington's more aggressive approach to Iran, likely wary of jeopardizing its own interests in the Gulf or getting dragged into a conflict that could spiral beyond what Trump has planned. However, the most interesting reactions have been those of Iran's closest allies, Russia and China. Dmitry Medvedev, the deputy chairman of the Russian Security Council, wrote on Telegram that the US had shown its true colors and that the negotiations had never been genuine. Other than this statement, Russia hasn't offered any support to Iran. China, on the other hand, hasn't even offered a statement condemning the attacks at the time of writing. And that's significant because just barely a week ago, Russia, China, and Iran held joint naval drills in the Strait of Hormuz under the Maritime Security Belt 2026 framework. The exercises were supposed to demonstrate trilateral military cooperation and signal to Washington that Iran wasn't alone. Yet, when American and Israeli jets began dropping bombs on Tehran, that partnership proved to be little more than theater. a shadow play that was ultimately as insubstantial as silhouettes projected on some distant stage. China's silence is even more telling because, as Middle East Eye revealed, China has been delivering offensive weapons as well as additional defensive arms to Iran, with 3 officials familiar with the matter confirming the transfers. Even more striking, Iran was close to finalizing a deal for Chinese-made CM-302 supersonic anti-ship cruise missiles before the strikes began. The CM-302, which can travel roughly 180 miles and fly low to evade ship defenses, is specifically designed to target aircraft carriers. Reuters reported that while the deal was close, no delivery date had been agreed on. Iran was also in talks to acquire Chinese surface-to-air missiles, man-portable air defense systems, anti-ballistic weapons, and anti-satellite weapons. Given all these weapons deals and the joint naval exercises, it's more than ironic that China hasn't issued an official response to the attacks against Iran yet. Beijing clearly doesn't want a pro-Western regime in Tehran, but it also doesn't want to risk its relationship with Washington or the Gulf states by being seen as directly backing Iran during active hostilities. Okay, so that's all we do know at the time of writing. A quick overview of the situation as it stands at this uncertain, fragile moment. Next, let's examine perhaps the more interesting part. What we don't know. What we don't know. The bigger question hanging over all of this is whether we're looking at the opening stages of a full-on regional war or just another round of strikes and counter-strikes that eventually fizzles out. Right now, nobody knows. Regional leaders have been pushing for weeks to prevent a full-on war for the simple reason that the results could be catastrophic. Now, though, Iran has proved willing to attack the Gulf states, and by demonstrating that it regards those nations as targets, it's given them all the justification they need to try and preempt future strikes against oil and gas infrastructure. We also need to talk about the Strait of Hormuz. About 20 million barrels of oil per day pass through the strait, representing roughly 27% of global maritime oil trade and a fifth of the world's total daily oil consumption. If Iran makes good on its threats to close or disrupt the strait, oil prices could spike, which would have severe inflationary effects on the global economy. Higher energy costs could slam manufacturing in China, India, South Korea, and Japan, which depend heavily on the shipments through the strait. Those costs get passed down supply chains and ultimately to consumers everywhere, driving up prices for everything from gasoline to groceries. Domestically, for President Trump, this could be the ultimate example of shooting himself in the foot, because Americans are already, to use the technical term, furious about the cost of living crisis. We also don't know the status of the negotiations. While it might seem obvious that Iran would walk away from the negotiations given the strikes, there is a possibility that the negotiations can still be salvaged. We say this because on Friday, as before the strike, Oman's foreign minister appeared on American TV to announce that a peace deal was within reach. Today's events obviously complicate the possibility of reaching a deal, and we should emphasize the United States has a recent history of using peace negotiations as a veil for strikes, as it did during Operation Midnight Hammer in 2025. But if Israel and the US are unable to decisively defeat Iran or to cripple the regime enough that the public overthrow it, then a deal might be the only solution to this conflict. There's also the question of regime survival. Iran's government has been reeling from internal pressure for weeks now. The January protests represent the largest uprising since the 1979 revolution, and Iran clearly viewed them as an existential threat, killing tens of thousands of its own people in an attempt to restore order. Trump clearly thinks the regime is vulnerable, which is why both he and Netanyahu publicly urged the Iranian people to overthrow their government. But experts are split on whether that's realistic. Narges Bajoli, an associate professor at Johns Hopkins, argues that the Islamic Republic has re-established control after the protests and shows no signs of immediate collapse. Meanwhile, analysts at RAND warn that while the regime can still suppress dissent through violence, the threat these protests pose shouldn't be downplayed because they expose deep weaknesses that make long-term survival uncertain. The regime's ability to weather this storm, in short, depends on several factors that we can't predict. Will senior IRGC commanders or political elites defect? Will the security forces hold or fracture under pressure? And most importantly, will the Iranian people rise up again now that American military power has weakened the regime's grip? Trump is betting they will. But history suggests that external military intervention often rallies people around their government rather than against it, even when they despise that government. Then there's the matter of what happens if the